Hello, comrades. Tonight's debate was scheduled many months ago. And as it transpires, of course, we all know now, it's taking place against a backdrop of horrendous and radically. In recent weeks, we've seen the election of a far-right Jewish supremacist religious fundamentalists to the Knesset. We turn on our TVs or social media, and we see mobs of Jewish youth wreaking havoc. We've seen or heard about the attempted lynching of an Arab man. There's been and continues to be, as we speak, significant eviction and displacements of Palestinians in the Sheikh Jarrah neighbourhood of the occupied East Jerusalem. The situation right now is going from bad to worse. Then there's the renewed campaign of rocket attacks on civilian targets in Israel by Hamas and other groups, with attacks on 5 synagogues. And of course, we then see the Israeli state responding with typical brutality and overwhelming military force. The latest Israeli assaults on Gaza have killed hundreds of Palestinians, including many children, targeting residential buildings. These actions go way beyond the right of any state to defend its population against military attacks. That said, I want to emphasize that Israel does have such a right, but the air assaults against Gaza are not defensive acts. These are the actions of a well-armed, heavily militarized state battering a blockaded and subjugated population living in what has justly been called an open-air prison. Alongside Israel's assaults and Hamas's rockets, we've seen intercommunal violence within Israel itself, with attacks by Jews on Arabs and attacks by Arabs against Jews, as I said, including at least 5 synagogues. It's said that war is a continuation of politics by other forcible means, and that is certainly what is happening here. Israel's war in Gaza is a continuation of politics of colonial expansion and aggressive national chauvinism. Hamas's rockets attacks against civilian targets are not merely a blowback or resistance to that. Hamas's attacks are too a continuation of politics, a thoroughly reactionary politics that are not merely for Palestinian self-determination or independence, but for the creation of a theocratic state. Wherever Hamas has held power, they have systematically destroyed trade union rights, democratic rights, the rights of women, and by the way, systematically terrorized other Palestinian organizations fighting for self-determination. Comrades, this has nothing to do with independent working class politics. In a very real sense, Hamas and Netanyahu are the far-right chauvinists on both sides, need each other. That is not to draw an equivalence or parity between an occupying colonial power, Israel, and the national people it subjugates, the Palestinians, but it would be patronizing to erase Hamas's politics from the picture we are discussing tonight. Red Flag says Hamas's rocket attacks are legitimate resistance. They say they stand in total solidarity with that resistance. A question I have for Red Flag is, how do you think the death of Israeli civilians, including the death of Israeli Arab civilians, moves the Palestinians even an inch closer to freedom? The consensus across the majority of the official politics in Israel is for the formal consolidation of a chauvinist one-state model. This will mean Israel's control over the whole territory, with whatever limited forms of self-government the Palestinians will be granted in the West Bank and Gaza. And these limited rights will be exercised within strict parameters determined by the Israeli state. In such a context, tonight's discussion feels simultaneously more important and more futile. It would be remiss not to acknowledge this. We are 2 small Trotskyist groups in Britain, neither of which have any direct presence in the region, debating policies and perspectives for an increasingly desperate situation of national oppression that neither side in this debate have any immediate means of affecting. But we're socialist internationalists. We are motivated by a worldview, and we fight to make that worldview the property of the international working class. This means we should always endeavour to analyse and understand the world around us, even if that endeavour of analysis and understanding is all we're able to do, and sadly, all too often, it is all we're able to do. Of course, I'm not arguing that socialists and labour movement activists can do nothing practically about the issue in the here and now. Hopefully, I'll have time at the end to say something on this. So I started by looking at the immediate situation. It would have been strange not to. But I now want to focus on the underlying situation and the relations of power that have driven these events, and importantly for us, what conclusions they imply for anyone seeking to advance independent working class politics. That is, the politics of international class struggle socialism. There are two fundamental realities that should condition a socialist analysis of Israel-Palestine. The first is the reality of national oppression, and the second is the presence of two national groups in the territory. Not as it was in South Africa, a majority of the population exploited by a narrow, relatively economically homogeneous settler caste. No, instead we're talking about two national groups, both of which are class differentiated, each has a bourgeoisie and a working class, both of which are nations by any operable definition of the concept. These two nations are Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. We oppose national oppression because as Socialist Internationalists, we are consistent democrats. Although nationhood is a construction, what Benedict Anderson refers to as an imagined community, it's a construction that cannot be wished out of historical existence. So while it exists, the right of a nation to govern itself, the right of self-determination, not to be forcibly conquered and governed by another nation, is a democratic right. The Israeli state, the state based on one of the two national groups living in historic Palestine, suppresses the right of the Palestinian nation to self-determination by its occupation regime, by its sponsoring of settlement expansion, and by its blockade of Gaza. Consistent democracy requires the levelling up of rights. This means full equality between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arab nations, including equal national rights up to and including independent nation states. This implies the Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and the creation of an independent Palestinian state with the same rights as Israel. And it must be supported by reparations from Israel and internationally to ensure that this is viable. The balance of forces on the ground make this outcome, an egalitarian two-state settlement, remote. No doubt about it. But the same balance of forces makes any one-state settlement, including the single binational state, which is the settlement that Red Flag now advocates, even less likely. We cannot change the balance of forces at will. We can only state honestly the political conclusions we derive from our analysis. The standard far-left line on Israel-Palestine is based on a campist anti-imperialist line, viewing this history only through the lens of European colonial expansion in the Middle East. This view ignores or denies many of the historical complexities of the national formation of the Israeli Jews and the foundation of the Israeli state. That history has to be revisited. Jewish immigration to Palestine was both a process of settlement, often displacing Arab communities, and the flight from oppression. The flight from the biggest atrocity of the 20th century, the systematic state-sponsored killing of 6 million Jews. For many Holocaust refugees, it was the only place to which they could flee. As Gilbert Achcar, a French Marxist academic, put it, it is indisputable that Eastern European Zionism emerged in reaction to an unbearable form of racist oppression, ultimately defined the Jews as a race and culminated in the Nazi genocide. The history of Israel-Palestine cannot be understood without understanding this duality at the heart of Zionism. A settler nationalism that othered the Arabs, yes, and a response to oppression, and was seen by many Jews as the only viable escape from that oppression, yes. This duality in no way justifies the displacement of Arab communities, nor the atrocities on both sides and expulsions of people on both sides in the context of the war surrounding Israel's foundation. But it does tell us what we are dealing with, a history too complex for a simplistic frame of imperialist colonial expansion. An unqualified anti-Zionism that ignores this duality is not only ahistoric, but it has built into it a tendency towards anti-Semitism. Maxime Roderson, another Marxist academic, who was, by the way, avowedly anti-Zionist and developed the analysis of Israel as a settler colonial state, said, The Jews of Israel too are people like any other people. Many went there because it was a preserver, a life preserver thrown to them. They most assuredly did not first engage in scholarly research to find out if they had a right to it, according to some Kantian morality or existentialist ethics. This should settle the question of what attitude socialists should take to the right of Jews to be in Palestine, or the legitimacy of the Jewish presence in the region. The Trotskyist tradition from which workers' liberty and Red Flag emerge was fairly clear on this. Excuse me. Trotskyists at the time supported the right of Jewish immigration to Palestine, and they roundly criticised the Stalinists for their support for Arab attacks led by the semi-feudal landlords on the Jewish settlers. In 1948, the Revolutionary Communist League, the small Trotskyist group in Palestine itself, denounced the Arab League's war on the fledgling Israeli state, in which some regimes were led by British colonial officers. They denounced it as a racial war on the Jews of Palestine. I now want to look at three specific differences workers' liberty has with Red Flag, and then hopefully conclude with some practical proposals. The first difference is two states or one state question. Workers' liberty says two states with equal rights. Red Flag says a binational state in which all citizens have equal rights. Okay. So if both nations in a binational state have equal rights, doesn't that mean they have the equal right to separate statehood? When Workers' Liberty debated a member of Red Flag's predecessor organisation on this question, the answer was given, yes, the Israeli Jews can have a state one day, but the Zionist Israeli state must be smashed first. It must be replaced with a democratic binational state, and then, if they want, the Jews can secede. How is the Israeli state to be smashed, comrade? The only consistently democratic basis on which the Israeli state can be smashed is as part of a working class anti-capitalist evolution necessarily involving the Israeli Jewish working class as well as the Palestinian Arab working class. And of course, workers' unity cannot possibly be constructed on the basis of a programme that puts off equal right to self-determination as something for the distant future. Equality of national rights have to be part of the programme for the immediate term. Workers' Liberty supports justice for Palestinian refugees. Oh, sorry, I've missed it. The second, first difference. The second difference I want to look at quickly is the right of return. So Workers' Liberty supports the justice for Palestinian refugees. Any lasting democratic settlement in the region will have to involve Israeli acknowledgement of the Nakba, the displacement of Palestinians in the process of Israel's formation. There's a joint Palestinian-Israeli initiative called Two States, One Homeland that seems to make some sense. It's a campaign arguing for a two-states model that rejects the unequal two-state solution that has prevailed in much of bourgeois diplomacy and geopolitics for some decades now. The Two States, One Homeland initiative says, two wrongs don't make a right. Jews will not be driven out of their homes so that their original Palestinian owners may be housed in them. They go on to say refugees will receive appropriate monetary compensation. Efforts will be made to rebuild towns and villages in areas that are presently unpopulated. They go on to say after becoming Palestinian citizens, the former refugees will have the freedom of movement throughout the homeland that they have been exiled from. They then say they will be allowed to make long-term visits and work there. A certain percentage will receive residential rights even in the first phase. They then say the next stages will be implemented gradually and in agreement. They say we must understand for Palestinians, this will not be a full return. We cannot satisfy everyone 100% on their desires. Freedom of movement and residence must be universal and apply to all refugees without any quotas or favours so that they can restore their relations with their homeland and their relatives who have stayed here. This approach, it seems to me, which is worked out by Palestinian and Israeli progressives who are active on the ground, working to foster unity and partnership between Arabs and Jews, is something that we have to listen to. The third and final difference I want to look at is the question of anti-imperialism. While Red Flag criticises Hamas's politics as dead end, it goes on to propose a united front with all anti-imperialist forces, regardless of their class nature or political programme. Red Flag says Hamas's attacks are a symbolic demonstration of determination of the Palestinian people, whose dignity and existence are inextricably linked to resistance to the occupation. Comrades, there is nothing symbolic about 300 plus rocket attacks on civilians, unless it is a symbol of a particular strain on the left, which is totally disconnected from the fate of civilians, of workers, Arab and Jewish. This is not class politics. Workers' liberty instead looks at the politics of workers' unity, not as something for the future that might emerge when Israel's been smashed, but as an immediate, necessary mechanism for achieving progress. The world, both historically and today, is full of instances where the working class of a given nation is ideologically and materially invested in the colonial or imperial policy of that nation and derives considerable material privilege from it. But if socialism is the emancipation of the working class, then independent working class politics involving working classes of the oppressor nations, as well as the oppressed ones, is the only basis on which socialism can be built. There are no shortcuts. We look to forces inside Israel working now, today, to win Israeli Jewish workers to an internationalist politics of equal rights, not a politics that tells Israeli Jews their self-determination will become operable if they manage to survive the smashing of Israel by an anti-imperialist united front involving Hamas, the theocrats, but a politics which poses equality of national rights as an immediate democratic demand. I'll end by saying the best contribution socialists in Britain can make to the working class and to the democratic struggle in Palestine is to boost the efforts of and provide direct solidarity for the forces of working class organisations within and crucially between the two national communities. We can look to independent workers' organisations like Power to Workers, a radical union independent of Israel's mainstream, which organises independent workers. We can look to the Democracy and Workers' Rights Centre in Ramallah, which organises Palestinian workers and recently has started to focus on organising women workers. We can look to the Workers' Advice Centre, a binational organisation organising both with Jewish and Arab workers in Israel and the occupied territories. We can look to a movement called Standing Together, an Arab-Jewish social movement which includes Palestinian socialist feminists like Masma Jajouli, Sally Abed and Rula Daoud among its leadership, and organises against war, occupation and racism, and on the explicit basis of Arab and Jewish unity and partnership. It's the only way to advance such politics and to progress, that can progress justice, that can win progress and justice for all. This is where hope lies. It's our job to do all we can to amplify this. That's it, comrades.
Thank you, Jill. Thanks very much. So I'll just hand straight over to Marcel, and you have up to half an hour as well. Just unmuting you. Yeah, great.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to begin by quoting the AWL's article about the latest attacks in Gaza. This is how they set the scene. Hamas, the political Islamist group ruling the Gaza Strip and allies, fired some 480 rockets at civilian targets in Israel on the 9th to 11th of May. The Israeli government responded by bombing hundreds of targets in Gaza. Escalation looks likely to continue. The article continues by demanding that the surrounding states recognize Israel's right to exist, and then argues that Israel has the right to defend itself, characterizing unspecified events in East Jerusalem as heavy-handed and condemning Hamas's attacks as being unjustified. In fact, the word Hamas appears 7 times in the article, including in the title. The words Sheikh Jarrah or occupation, for example, do not appear once. This article is, of course, consistent with the AWL's characterization of the Palestinian struggle in recent years. And what it shows, as I'll explain, is that our differences go far deeper than the question of one state or two, which is the title of the debate. Let's start by looking a little closer at the AWL's analysis. The AWL demands recognition for Israel's right to exist. By contrast, we do not really argue that any state has an abstract right to existence. That is, one that's independent of or unconnected to its relations to other peoples. And oppressed people within a state do have a right to determine whether they separate from that state or not. A settler state built up the colonization of land inhabited by another people, making itself a majority by driving them out or keeping them deprived of citizenship, cannot be regarded as having or exercising this democratic right. We call for the revolutionary overthrow of capitalist states and their replacement with socialist secular states with democratic planned economies. The AWL believes that Israel's bombing campaign against Gaza, well, they mention self-defense in the same breath as this bombing campaign, but as we all know, having locked up 1.5 million people in Gaza and subjecting them to a state of siege, having shot 9,000 unarmed protesters 3 years ago during the Great Return March, anyone should realize that self-defense does not come into this at all. And it is no different now when Israel is targeting apartment blocks, schools, journalists' offices with their bombs. The only thing that Israel is defending is its own occupation of Palestine by inflicting a collective punishment and campaign on terror against the Palestinian people for daring to resist. And on the topic of resistance, which in the AWL's article states is not justified on this occasion, it is actually justified. And this isn't simply my opinion as Marcel from Red Flag. This is a right under international law that under occupation, you have a right to resist the occupying power. Now, of course, speaking dispassionately about Palestine at a time like this isn't easy. But we shouldn't forget that the latest Israeli aggression didn't start, as the AWL's article would have you believe, with rockets from Hamas. Rockets which, by the way, are mostly improvised projectiles made up of irrigation pipes. This started with the evictions of Palestinians from the Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, itself part of a long-term program of what the Israeli government calls the Judaicization of Jerusalem. This is how Israel itself describes the process. Israel wants to kick Palestinian families out of the city, manufacture a Jewish majority with the aim of eventually annexing the area to create a unified Jerusalem within the state of Israel. And East Jerusalem is not only occupied illegally by the Israeli military, but it's actually the city that Israel have tricked the world into believing that it wants to be the capital of a Palestinian state. What this shows, and this will be a theme of my introduction, is that the question of one or two states is tied up with the question of colonialism, but we'll come to this later. It's also necessary to mention how Israel has responded to the Palestinian protests against the evictions, shooting worshippers around the Al-Aqsa Mosque with rubber-coated, not rubber, bullets, stun grenades, beating several times, and before long, bombing indiscriminately in Gaza. Over 100 Palestinians have been killed at the hands of the Israeli military, whilst several more have been killed during the pogroms that have taken place inside of Israel's recognized borders. But the Sheikh Jarrah evictions and Israel's punitive response to the protesters tells us actually a lot more about the Israeli state. In the first instance, it's further proof that the expulsion of 800,000 Palestinians in what became known as the Nakba was not an isolated incident, after which Israel would behave as a normal state, if you like, but rather the beginning of a process of constant expulsion, constant dispossession, and constant ethnic cleansing that would continue to the present day and will continue beyond. It also shows that attempts to come to an agreement with the Israeli state on the basis of partitioning the land will always be futile, as Israel is dependent on yet further expansion, be it through the evictions in Jerusalem, the upcoming planned annexation of the Jordan Valley, or the continued and indeed intensified settlement construction program across the West Bank. More specifically, it shows how little respect it actually has for the very two-state solution that it says that it supports in principle, when in reality they're doing all they can to stop this from ever being a possibility. So this is the situation we find ourselves in this debate. And the question is, should we try and hold Israel to its promise of a two-state solution, or rather, should we demand something else? I think to suggest solutions in isolation can be quite utopian. Instead, our answer to the question should be a result of an analysis of the Israeli state, of Zionism as an ideology, and of what the Palestinians need to achieve their own liberation. So the AWL's support for two states, we argue, is a consequence of serious misanalyses of the Israeli state. And we think its program for the region is one that is filled with reformism, fails to solve the Palestinian national question, and makes too many concessions to Zionism. And its support for two states is just one way that this presents itself. Our difference on the question of one or two states is derived from our analysis of the Israeli state. To us, Israel is a colonial project, and it's not simply the expression of Jewish self-determination. Similarly, we reject Zionist ideology as the official ideology of this project. We therefore don't have any sympathy for the claim that maintaining a Jewish majority in Israel is a right that can be claimed in the name of national self-determination. No nation can make such a claim. Therefore, we call for the right of Palestinian refugees under international law to return to the land from which they were ethnically cleansed. This ought to be upheld. We unapologetically support the right of return. We acknowledge the overwhelming evidence that Israel is a colonial project, that it's centrifugal to the imperialist world order, and that Zionism is a reactionary ideology. Only as a consequence of this analysis can we show that the two-state solution is not only utopian, but fundamentally unjust, and a solution which will neither resolve the struggle for Palestinian rights or offer anything to the working classes of either Palestine or Israel. Let's start from the beginning. Is Israel a colonial state, or is it a national state of Israeli Jews? And I know we heard earlier that the AWL is simultaneously both of these things, but I think this formulation confuses more than it explains. All colonial projects have relied on the oppression of the colonists in their home countries, not only to, but because the promise of a life free from oppression is central to the colonizing project. This is precisely what happened with settlers in the Americas, with the Boers in South Africa, although of course we do accept that this is a more extreme case when it came to Jewish settlers in Palestine. But in the first instance, it's necessary to point out that actually early Israeli leaders did indeed see themselves as colonizers. David Ben-Gurion, for example, described Israel's role as bringing European civilization into the region, saying that his model of civilization is based on Britain, which at the time was the main sponsor of the Zionist project. Earlier figures such as Herzl obviously also talked about transporting German values into the Mediterranean. Similarly, they saw the Palestinians not as an equal people with whom they could share the land, but as a sort of inconvenient obstacle to their settlement. Everyone is familiar with the Zionist slogan that Palestine had been a land without a people. But beyond this classic colonial trope, the writings at the time contained huge amounts of colonial attitudes towards the Palestinians, saying that they were incapable of self-government, that they had no attachment to the land. To this day, Israeli politicians regularly reproduce these attitudes, which find their most extreme forms in the wider population, with the Israeli gangs we've seen recently shouting death to Arabs, and the grotesque viewing parties for the airstrikes against Gaza. More specifically, Israel is a settler colonial state in the same mold as North American, South American countries. With both Israel and historical cases, the aim of the colonization is not simply to win the resources of the country, but it goes further by attempting to eliminate the native population, either through displacement, through marginalization, or through integration. And then the next stage is to build a state for the colonizers and put their efforts into normalizing this new regime. Indeed, the foundation of Israel was not a gift to Europe's Jews, nor was it even the result of a national struggle. Rather, it was a deliberate decision by Britain, the United States, and originally the Soviet Union, who calculated that an outpost in the Middle East, generally supportive of their hegemonic role in the region, would benefit their imperialist interests. Britain had supported for a long time Jewish organizations' development in the Mandate of Palestine, as well as assisting them in bringing capital in the country, giving them preferential wages and conditions over Palestinians. Knowing that their mandates in the Middle East would soon expire, they wanted to create a local ruling class who could keep markets open for them and could provide a base for their future military activities in the region. And with Britain's decline, it's now US imperialism, which is exploiting the Israeli outposts for its own ends. It grants Israel's billions in military aid, and in return collaborates in its Cold War against Iran, has preferential access to Israeli high-tech weapons industry, and can use Israeli airspace and military bases for its imperialist wars in the region. And any capitalist endeavor which is as ambitious as the colonization program requires an ideology to legitimize itself. And that's precisely what Zionism is. It's essential to remember that Zionism had long been a minority belief amongst European Jews. And it was indeed the right-wing response to anti-Semitism in Europe originally. Socialists, more often than not, fought for Jewish liberation within their European countries. It was only really with the growing support for nationalism generally, and then of course the horrors of the Holocaust, which created widespread support for Zionism amongst European Jews. At its most fundamental level, Zionism is the belief that there should be a Jewish state, or more specifically, a state with a majority Jewish population and institutionalized privileges for that Jewish population. On a very basic level, this is practically what all national ideologies call for. Indeed, the AWL call for Israeli self-determination precisely on the basis that they constitute a majority inside their 1948 borders. But any comparison between Israel and countries that are genuinely the product of a national struggle ends with even the most basic glance at the history of how Israeli Jews came to be a majority in their country. The fact that Israel has this majority is only the product of ethnic cleansing, first through the Nakba, and since then through a series of other expulsions and the continued denial of the rights of refugees to return. Of course, Israel does not allow the refugees to return, precisely because it would destroy the basis of the Zionist state. In such a case, it would find itself governing over a majority Palestinian population who would were they given any democratic rights, refused to be treated as second-class citizens. And the AWL, by and large, accepts the Zionist imperative of exclusion of Palestinians. Most shockingly, as we've heard already, the organisation opposes the right of return, which in previous articles they've described as the collective repossession of the territory, which they say privileges people on the basis of ethnicity. This could not be more wrong. What return delivers is not privileged rights, but equal rights for the expelled Palestinians. It gives them precisely the same rights that is given to American, Russian, or British Jews who have never even set foot in Palestine before. The AWL, I believe, mischaracterize and minimize this demand by claiming it will only be exercised by the grandchildren of the refugees. But first of all, the grandchildren of those that were expelled are, by definition, refugees themselves. This is, again, a definition under international law, but by the basic fact that the majority of them live in squalid conditions in refugee camps in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and on the outskirts of what are already very poor cities in very poor countries. Furthermore, we're simply not just dealing with the grandchildren of expelled Palestinians. This is something that happened in very recent history in the greater scheme of things. Many of the people who were expelled in the Nakba are still alive today and still waiting for their right to return. The AWL accepts the Zionist claim that Palestinian rights must be suspended in the name of abstract Israeli national rights. Shows, I believe, a misunderstanding of the Marxist approach to the national question. Clearly, the right to self-determination isn't an absolute right. In other words, Marxists cannot support a claim to self-determination where it quite demonstrably denies the possibility of another nation's right to self-determination, as is the case here. But could it be argued that the creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel could resolve the contradictions that Israel faces as a settler colonial state? Absolutely not, I would say. In the first instance, the proposed two-state solution is now an effective impossibility. Since the start of its occupation, Israel has now settled almost 1 million of its own citizens illegally into the West Bank, including in East Jerusalem. The cost of removing these settlers would be astronomical, and I think quite a reactionary endeavor compared to the possibility of allowing Jews and Palestinians to settle anywhere within historic Palestine. Of course, we cannot leave the question at its impossibility, but we also need to point out that there are inherent injustices involved with the two-state solution. In any case, we're dealing with a deeply unfair partition of historic Palestine. The Palestinians are going to receive no more than 22% of their historic homeland, despite being greater in number than the Israeli Jews, who will receive 78% of it. And that is not including the millions more refugees outside of Palestine. The two major territories would be separated by Israel, who would have the power to restrict travel between the West Bank and Gaza. But to speak in any greater depth about the problems with the two-state solution, we have to look at its concrete proposals. And the clearest and most recent indication of precisely how a two-state solution will be implemented came out last year with Trump's deal of the century. The proposal not only represents the official position of the United States government, but also the basis of Israel's policy in the coming years. Indeed, a lot of what was proposed in the so-called deal is currently being carried out by Israel, regardless of how insane we all thought the proposals were when they first came out. And they are doing it with a degree of support from the surrounding Arab states. Anyone who has read the plan will recognize immediately that the state promised to the Palestinians is little more than an Israeli protectorate. Israel will be able to veto Palestinian membership of any international organization, such as Interpol or the Arab League. Israel will be able to put significant restrictions on how developed the Palestinian military can become. And Israel would retain control over Palestinian borders, airspace, fisheries, and would have the right to invade Palestinian territory at its pleasing. The plan also promises even more land for Israel. Most of the settlements would be annexed, as well as the entirety of the Jordan Valley. As Israel prepares to carry out these annexations in plain sight of the entire world, one could reasonably argue that this is the deal of the century is not a serious proposal for two states, but it's a smokescreen behind which Israel can further destroy any hopes of a Palestinian state. But to say this would simply be to remark on the entire history of the proposed two-state solution. This is precisely the outcome of the Oslo Accords. The Palestinian leadership has agreed in principle, and indeed to some of the treaties in the past, is more evidence of the weakness of their leadership and the desperateness of the Palestinian situation than it is the feasibility or fairness of such a proposal. Furthermore, the proposal for two states doesn't resolve the crises inside the state of Israel. The almost 2 million Palestinians living inside the 1948 borders will continue to face the same discrimination and oppression that they do at the moment. And the discrimination they face at the moment is actually very severe. Israeli neighborhoods have the right to refuse residency to Palestinian citizens of Israel. They also face huge restrictions on their right to political organization, including a ban on anti-Zionist parties from running in elections for the Israeli parliament. Palestinians inside Israel also face harassment and imprisonment of their own political activists. And most recently, as we've all seen, violence from Israeli extremists in the streets. This is, I think, the reality of being a minority in a non-secular state. Furthermore, with two states, the question of right of return is still not settled. With the two-state solution, the Palestinian refugee crises in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, etc., are simply replaced by a new refugee crisis in the West Bank. It's neither reasonable nor fair, let alone socialist, to try to resettle the world's largest refugee population on a tiny and incredibly impoverished fragment of land when at the same time the country that expelled them and the country to which they want to return has far more resources to host them. On several occasions, the AWL has accused much of the left of holding Israel to a different standard to other states. And by way of conclusion, I would like to turn this accusation around and say that we actually have a consistent approach to repressive and chauvinistic capitalist states. By contrast, it's the AWL, I believe, who afford Israel a series of privileges that no socialist would accept for other countries. A right to maintain a Jewish majority at the expense of the largest refugee population in the world, a right to veto the most basic rights of the Palestinians in the abused name of self-determination, and a right to launch vicious bombing campaigns which leave hundreds of civilians dead in the name of self-defense. I don't think we would say this about any other states. The reality is that the Zionist project is not only a humanitarian catastrophe in its own right, but it's a fundamental barrier to socialism, both in Palestine and in the countries of the region where its military and political interventions are focused. We can't overcome this simply by putting a fragmentary Palestinian state alongside this. Instead, we call for the overthrow of the Israeli state, solidarity with the Palestinian resistance, right of return for millions of expelled Palestinian refugees, and a single secular and socialist Palestine where Jews and Palestinians can live equally. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Marcel. Okay, so we now have time, I think, well, as the speakers took a bit less than half an hour for probably about 15 or more contributions, if comrades keep their contributions short. So I'm going to take somebody from Workers' Liberty first, just as you know, then, and then Richard, I hope, is going to advise me who I should take next. Okay, I'll take Ed Maltby, as you had your hand up first. I'll ask you to unmute.
Hi, comrades, and I'd like to thank the people in both groups who've organised this debate. I think there's two problems with the one state position that Marcel has put forward. So the first one is it's a break. So as Jill explained, it's a break from the Trotskyist tradition of how you deal with the national question in the region, but it's also more broadly, it's a break from most traditions of national liberation struggles. I can't think historically of an example of a nation that has fought off colonial domination only to say voluntarily we are going to dissolve our entity into a joint state with the people who previously have been oppressing us. So, for example, you take what Marx wrote about Ireland and Britain, and his slogan was first separation, then federation. You look at the way that the national question was dealt with immediately after the Russian Revolution, and a federal relationship between the former empire and many former colonies was set up, but only after the nationhood of the minority nations of the Russian Empire was more kind of strongly asserted with greater degrees of autonomy or even full independence. I can't think of an example of someone who's doing what Marcel is proposing that the Palestinians should do, which is to voluntarily dissolve any claim to an independent state of their own. And presumably, as well as thinking that getting rid of settlers from Palestinian territory is reactionary, Marcel also thinks that efforts to win recognition for a Palestinian state internationally would also be reactionary, which I think is rather odd. I'm in favor of getting rid of the settlers from Palestinian territory. I'm in favor of recognizing Palestine. And just in general, the experience of history is that oppressed peoples want their statehood. The second thing, I'll speed up now, is look, the problem with what you do about 6 million, more or less, Israeli Jews who are there in a compact area in the region, they want a country called Israel to continue to exist. Saying that you want something to be resolved by a revolution isn't like waving a magic wand. You can't make a revolution over the national aspirations of 6 million people, and you've not explained, what do you propose, that we just wait for them all to change their minds? Do we propose that they be conquered in a war? I don't think either of those are very good options.
Thank you, Ed. Okay, so I'm now going to take Andy W. I can just see where he is. There you go. I'll just ask you to unmute.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think in the previous debate in 2010, Camilla Bassi said that recognized that Israel and Palestine was an extremely particular and peculiar situation, one could say exceptional. And I think it's true that the question of a binational state for both peoples is exceptional, but so is the situation in Israel-Palestine very clearly, especially when you dial in the refugees, which the AWL again and again denies the national rights of the Palestinians by denying the right of return to the Palestinian refugees, something we wouldn't do for any other people anywhere else. And, you know, the Kurds don't have a claim to the land, the rest of Turkey. The Rohingya don't have a claim to the rest of Myanmar, but I'm afraid that the privileges of the Israeli working class and the Israeli people as a whole derive from the land and the labor until very recently, when Palestinian labor was replaced with immigrant labor in order to be able to stop the powerful intifadas that were hurting the revolts over hurting the Israeli economy, used the Oslo Accords cynically to build and expand settlements in the West Bank, but also to wire out Palestinian labor so they didn't rely on it. But they still have the land, and I'm afraid that the only just solution for both peoples has to be a binational state, and that won't be one. It's clear from the Israeli state, the most powerful military state in the Middle East, through peaceful reform means, but through revolt and revolution. And the Palestinians are forced into those revolts precisely because of the aggression of the state and its need to expand in order to retain its Jewish character, and also to dampen down the class contradictions within Israel itself. But I wanted to say, really, the Middle East is strategic for the United States and for Britain. Oil, but also Suez. We shouldn't forget the 1956 attempt to grab the Suez Canal by British, French, and Israeli imperialism together, which the new hegemons slapped down the United States. But Israel's not imperialist, it's a settler colony, but we still have to use imperialist to analyze it. It's a privileged semi-colony, probably the most privileged in the world. Why is it privileged? Because it plays an indispensable role to the United States and to Britain, which is that it's a deniable Rottweiler on a long lead. When you want to bomb Iraq or Syria or any of the other regimes, if you want to intimidate the Arab states, because Israel is by far the most powerful military state in the region and has been for decades, thanks to US aid, it allows Israel to do that and then simply have to block or veto any condemnation of Israel in the Security Council. And there's scores of Security Council, or rather General Assembly UN resolutions against occupied territories, etc. It's Britain and America on the Security Council that protect it. And it's well known that America, for instance, Israel is the biggest recipient of foreign aid. It is year in and year out, 3 or 4 times often the next recipient, and it's received something like 250 billion pounds since its inception from the United States, and is guaranteed by the United States. There's a 2020 US Congress report out that's just stated this, that it's guaranteed.
Could you wind up?
Superiority, absolutely, over the rest of the Arab states. The Palestinians will. Every struggle in the Middle East faces the states backed by US imperialism in the region. Those revolutions, when they occur, as the Arab Spring shows, inevitably have a regional character. The Palestinians absolutely have to demand solidarity from the Israeli workers, who, to become revolutionary, will have to abandon their national privileges and chauvinism and join in a struggle for the Palestinians' equality and the right of return. And that will have a regional basis. And even more so, they have to join in struggle with the masses of the region if they're to succeed. And that is part of the revolutionary project to overturn capitalism, imperialism in the Middle East. And the Palestinians are absolutely an essential part of that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to take Jim. I'm just trying to unmute you, Jim. There we go.
Okay. Thank you. Right, where to begin? First of all, let's assume that the comrades from Red Flag are right, and that the only viable solution is a single binational state of Jews and Arabs. The question I'd like to put to them, which none of them have answered, although the last comrade came out with a rather strange formulation about the Jewish working class voluntarily giving up their rights and privileges. But the question I'd like to ask is, what force is going to bring that about? Surely as Marxists, a crucial question is, what force do we look to actually change a situation? There is no example in human history, for instance, of a people having once established national self-determination voluntarily giving it up. Do you, comrades, seriously believe, even if we were to think it was desirable, that the Palestinians have the capability of overthrowing the Israeli state? No. The only actual realistic force that could possibly bring that about would be the surrounding Arab bourgeoisies, the surrounding Arab states, who are going to create apparently a democratic secular state in Israel. You know, those forces that are not actually themselves particularly notable for being either democratic or secular. So that's the crucial question I'll ask the comrades. What force is going to bring it about? How is it going to be brought about? Just briefly, a couple of other things. Marcel, in his opening remarks, referred to Israel simply as a settler colonial state in the same way as, say, America or Australia, leaving out of account the specific circumstances that led to the creation of that state. Now, some Zionists use the Holocaust and use the events of the 1940s to more or less justify anything Israel does. That's certainly not what I'm trying to do, and not what the AWL tries to do. It's not an excuse for the barbarity of a lot of Israel's behaviour, but it is something that has to be borne in mind. And it is something that's very important to understand when you simply describe Israel as a settler colonial state. Well, it isn't simply a settler colonial state. It's a state that came into existence under very specific circumstances. Isaac Deutscher, I think, was right in describing it as a lifeboat state. And I really think that the comrades are leaving out deliberately leaving out a very, very important aspect of how Israel came into existence. As I say, it doesn't excuse everything that Israel does, but you're making a big mistake, comrades, if you simply ignore that. And finally, the idea that Israel was, and again, I think Marcel suggested this, was a creation of British imperialism, is just nonsense. It just doesn't stand up to historic scrutiny. By the 1940s, British imperialism actually opposed Zionism. I think, but I stand to be corrected on this, I think Britain didn't vote for the partition and the creation of the Israeli state at the UN. And certainly they were in favour of boycotting Israel's right to armaments during the 1948 war. And in fact, Israel would not have obtained armaments were it not for the support of the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia. So even your basic history is wrong, comrades, regardless of the fact that your conclusions are clearly wrong as well. Thank you.
Just having a look for Tim next. Oh, there you are, Tim. I'll just ask you to unmute.
Yeah, so I want to come back on the point that was raised about the role of Hamas. They're often referred to by the pro-imperialist press and by the AWL as well as as this bogeyman, which means that the Palestinian movement can't be supported. But we have to start from the position that the Israeli occupation of Palestine is illegitimate and can't be resolved until the Israeli state is dismantled. The state was installed by imperialism to colonize and repress the Arab people in the Middle East. And so therefore Palestinian resistance to that is completely legitimate, and it's our role as the working class in core imperialist countries to provide solidarity with that resistance. We can disagree with certain tactics. The rockets not only is for dangerous to civilians wrong, it's also ineffective as a form of resistance. We can oppose the leadership of a colonial movement. Hamas does have a reactionary ideology, and we should absolutely oppose its leadership of the resistance. However, we cannot, as the working class of an imperialist country, we cannot put preconditions on our solidarity. It's not our place to insist that the Palestinian people install a leadership that we would prefer before we give them our solidarity. All we can do is build a solidarity movement in Britain, call for the working class movement in Britain to provide solidarity to the Palestinian people. And while doing that, we are able to, and we should, make criticisms of particular tactics or politics of the leadership that we may disagree with. But there cannot be, and we cannot impose preconditions on our support. the role of Hamas is too often used as an excuse for the pro-imperialist politics of, say, the right of the Labour Party, of liberals in Britain and America, in order to withhold what they withhold solidarity. And we have to be absolutely clear that there is no excuse, irrespective of the politics of Hamas. The continued repression of the Palestinian people should be opposed, and we need to offer unconditional solidarity to those people.
Thank you, comrades. Okay, so I'm going to take next Martin Thomas, then Manoa, then Ben, and then I'm slightly sort of losing count of where we're up to. I will probably sort of like ask for comrades who, you know, want to ask questions and explore issues in a general sense. Okay, so Martin, you're next. I'm trying to unmute you.
All right, I will mute you now. Thanks, Hattie. Look, I would like to see a single and secular and democratic state in Palestine. Actually, not just in Palestine, but in the whole region. My argument is, first argument is, in what way does support for Hamas conceivably point us towards it? It seems to be no more than would have support for the Arab states in the 1948 war, which no Trotskyist at the time advocated. Why does support for Hamas not contribute to that in any way? Firstly, because that's simply not what Hamas is for. They're not in favor of democracy, and they're not in favor of secularism. They are in favor of a single state ruled by themselves, but unless you're saying that a single state ruled by Hamas is at least a step forward to your objective, which I would deny, I can't see how that makes any sense at all. You talk about the Israeli workers will have to abandon chauvinism. That certainly cannot be brought about by directing rockets to kill them. With the promise, look, what you should do is welcome the people who fired these rockets in to run your country. That is not possible. Is the idea that Hamas will at some point militarily overwhelm the Israeli state? Well, fortunately, that's not the case. As you said, Israel is a militarily powerful state. Hamas's technology isn't. So what that means, in fact, you have, as a long game, a very bloody perspective, I think, which is Hamas somehow overwhelms the Israeli state. You have a single state, which is not democratic and secular yet, but maybe you hope it will become that. In the meantime, however, you're offering a complete dead end because that's not going to happen. All this, look, you can get a single democratic secular state in an area only by the free agreement of the nations in that area. That's otherwise your single state is based on the national suppression of one of the nations in the area, and it's not democratic. In fact, in this case, it can be imposed only by extreme repression. And to get a socialist revolution, you have to unite the workers in the different nationalities. And that cannot be done on a program of the suppression of one nationality by another, even if that's, and it doesn't make it any better if that suppression is militarily unfeasible. All that means is by pointing to support for Hamas as the way forward, you're pointing to something which leads them into a complete dead end. And well, the promise that somehow this is going to happen, somehow things are going to be resolved by socialism. But on your argument, even under socialism, it won't be possible, because even under socialism, the Israeli Jews will still bear this mark of sin, which, in your view, deprives them of the right of national self-determination of other nations.
I've got Minerva next. Just unmute you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, comrades, for organizing this a very important debate. So, first of all, I'd like to respond to this question posed by the Alliance for Workers' Liberty. What force is going to bring about a single state? So we would like to, I guess, pose the same question to you. What force is going to bring about an end to Israeli expansionism and its withdrawal to agreed borders and a viable Palestinian state? And I mean, your solution would also require a revolutionary mobilization of the Israeli working class in pursuit of an equitable Israeli-Palestinian settlement and overthrow of the existing state apparatus. So I think it's, to think that such a revolution could occur in Israel, but then favor an ethnically exclusive Jewish state existing after that is, I think, completely absurd. I also happen to have the misfortune to read the statement of the Alliance for Workers' Liberty. I think your statement sounds like you're just unhappy with the folks governing Israel right now. And as Marxists, I think we have to go beyond just the government, and we have to talk about the characterization of the state at hand. You are completely uncritical of the character of the state and its ideology of Zionism. The comrade from the Alliance for Workers' Liberty talked about how we as Marxists recognize the right to national self-determination, and by virtue of that, the Zionist state also has the right to exist. I would like to remind comrades that the right to national self-determination does not mean the right to occupy, colonize, and annex. Such a disingenuous attempt at creating a false binary between the settler colonial Zionist project and an oppressed, displaced people is frankly pathetic, in my opinion. We do not recognize the right of Israel to exist, which is why we cannot support the two-state solution. And I think we have to keep in mind that there's a difference between the British colonialism in, say, India and the settler colonialism of Israel, which has come to stay and carve out an illegal state based on some religious fairy tales. Should we rely on a bourgeois apartheid state to stick to its promise of a two-state solution? I would like to ask comrades of the Alliance for Workers' Liberty that since when have we as Marxists been relying on bourgeois states for resolution of conflict? The fact that the question of property, which has historically been at the heart of the so-called conflict, has been brushed under the carpet in your statement is really telling. The displacement of Palestinians and occupation of their lands, which again resurfaced in the recent spate of Israel-led violence in the region, is the class question to which the Alliance for Workers' Liberty seems to have no answer or no interest. I think that our demand for the formation of socialist United States of the Middle East and a socialist revolution for the freedom of Palestine is the correct demand. It is not dependent upon the Jewish working class breaking with the privileges it enjoys in the Zionist state. And this is just not necessary, but also possible. And if anyone thinks that democratic demands can't be used to further a revolution, then all I can say is that comrades have yet to understand the transitional method. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, so next on my list is Ben. I'll just unmute you. Thank you.
Thanks, comrades. So Marcel, in his opening, said that attempts to make agreements with the Israeli state will always be futile based on its past record. And he also said that the settlers can't be removed. The settlers who've gone past the sort of the borders of Israel, because the cost would be exorbitant and it would be reactionary. The comrade from the IBT said that a solution is impossible under capitalism. So all of these statements push towards a position that any measure of relief or freedom for the Palestinians currently under bombardment and repression is postponed to this sort of distant revolutionary situation. Now, I agree that the leaders of the Israeli state and the ruling class and the far-right secular paramilitaries are completely intransigent, but we're not UN liberals. We don't rely simply on bourgeois diplomatic negotiations that sort of accept the starting red lines of the Israeli ruling class. We believe in the power of the working class to break that intransigence. And that power is not just an on-off switch that's either zero or complete socialist consciousness and revolution in the way that the comrades from Red Flag have spoken as if it is. Marcel called two states utopian. It's quite the opposite. Most Palestinians want a Palestinian state. Most Israelis want an Israeli state. So the demand for both of those to be fulfilled, imperfectly as they would be, is nevertheless a basis, a working basis for workers' unity. That work is concretely being done on the ground right now by unions like Waqman and social movements like Standing Together, who organize people of both groups on their shared class interest while demanding a withdrawal from the occupation. Marcel also spoke as if nations only get self-determination if they were historically oppressed. But Red Flag has previously supported the right of the Scottish nation to have a referendum. So no one could argue realistically, except the most deluded of the Scotnats, that Scotland is an oppressed state. Nevertheless, if the Scottish people want a referendum, obviously this is not entirely comparable, but it demonstrates that clearly self-determination is a general right. Because to deny it would involve, even if that oppression is not currently happening, a repression of those people. I want to read something that one of the leaders of Standing Together, that Jewish Arab social movement, said about this question. The idea of one state as an immediate solution to the present situation might sound nice, but how is it to be achieved? You have two distinct national groups, both of which have a strong will to self-determination. How are you going to force these people into the framework of a single state from this point? The only viable immediate solution is ending the occupation and fulfilling the Palestinian right to self-determination by establishing a Palestinian state alongside Israel. If you want to dream, why stop at one state? Why not a socialist federation of the Middle East? That's my dream, and it is not something that I plan to stop dreaming of once we have two states. Two states is not an endpoint. I want to go beyond that, but we need to get there first. Two states should not be posed as a solution. It is not a solution. It is a partial advance. It's a stepping stone. The utopian position is the one that postpones relief from the immediate bombardment and intense repression and discrimination to this sort of distant socialist revolution, which clearly is a long way off. We propose two states not as a utopia, but precisely as an organizing slogan for a movement that can win some level of concession, some level of relief, and some level of freedom.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, so our next speaker is Dave Stockton, then Duncan, then George. Then I'm going to see if I can sneak in a couple of non-red flag, non-workers' people. So we'll just have to see how the time goes. So Dave, you're next. I've just unmuted you.
Oh,
There
right.
we go.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, the problem, is quite simple, and that is, how are we going to bring about, this situation? Either the beautiful and I think genuinely utopian social, two states where oppression has ended, for the Palestinians, and everyone is living together, with their neighbours, as it were, across a border, or a single state solution. The truth is, Martin's thing about, this means, we want Hamas to conquer Israel, he quite rightly, and we quite rightly, realise that that's an impossibility anyway. What we have to say, though, is that the existing Zionist state, oppressing the Palestinians, bombarding Gaza and killing, and all the things that have been mentioned, that are going on there, that state, cannot be the state, which which lives alongside a Palestinian state and which grants it rights. It's not that kind of state. That's not how it was built, and it will never be that kind of state. So it has to be, got rid of. It has to be destroyed. is that going to be done by surrounding Arab states? No. Is it going to be done by Hamas? Certainly not. So how could it be done? Well, I'm sorry, but I think the really crucial question, will it be done by the Israeli working class? No, because the Israeli working class, unfortunately, as long as it has that state and has those privileges, it will always, refuse to support the Palestinians' legitimate democratic demands. I'm not saying all Palestinian workers. I'm sure there are excellent groups of people who do that. So how do we actually do it? Well, the international working class has to sort of, intervene in this question, because Israel is, in a very important sense, dependent, on the support of the European and American imperialists. I don't mean just in terms of money, and military things, although they're important, but, it's protected in the United Nations, and that it's got a guarantee from those states. We have to end that guarantee, and the working class of Europe and North America have to end that guarantee by forcing their ruling class, to abandon that sort of support. When we do that, it will have an effect on the Israeli working class as well as the thing, because the Israeli working class have to realize they cannot go on with a settler state which oppresses the Palestinians.
Duncan, I'm unmuting you.
So one of the comrades from Red Flag said, do you rely on the bourgeois states to solve this national problem? And that's absolutely not what we do. I mean, with Workers' Liberty, the point about the two-state program is it's a program that allows the Israeli Jewish working class and the Arab Palestinian working class a program which they could unite around to settle the scores, both to sort the national problem, but to give a program where they can settle scores with the bourgeois leaders on both sides of that divide. And I think that's the point. And the point is, I mean, if we just listen to what Dave Stockton said a moment or two ago, is it realistic that a democratic program could unite the Arab and Jewish working class? Yes, I think it is. Is it realistic that the international working class is going to solve this problem from outside for the Arab and Jewish working class? What would that even look like? Since when have national questions been solved by fact people out, or the working class outside the nations? Previously, one of the comrades said that the Workers' Liberty denied the right to return, and that, and I think that what we say about the right of return is this: is without a settlement, without a just settlement, what we're talking about is the destruction of Israel by any other name. And it's worth remembering about the refugees. These refugees have been kept as a political pawn by the Arab states in refugee camps for over 60 years now. And sometimes we're talking about children of the original refugees and grandchildren of original refugees who have never set foot inside Israel-Palestine. Now, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be part of a settlement, repatriations, but the notion that you just accept millions of people coming back in without any just settlement is not a part of a socialist democratic program for the Middle East. It's a battering ram to end the Israeli state, and I think that politically, what we need to do is, as I said before, is find a program which can unite the working class in the area, not beat down and up one or the other working class.
Okay, so George, I'm just going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah, thank you. Georg from Germany, Arbeiterin Macht. First of all, I really have to say, I do like the fact that we're discussing but I'm really appalled by the discussion still. And I can understand why I've seen so few Palestinians speak and also participate in the conversation, because I think most of them simply couldn't bear it. I think there is so much hypocrisy in some of the things that have been said, and I'm going to speak briefly on the Hamas question. So our statement reads, sporadic rocket attacks on Israel by Palestinian resistance organizations are desperate actions in an asymmetric war. There can be little more than a symbolic demonstration of the deep determination of the Palestinian people to continue to resist. The fact that rockets have reached not only Ashkelon, but Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, however, reminds Israelis that they're not completely invulnerable under the Iron Dome, funded in large measure by the USA. So I'd like to know from you if you agree that this is a fact or it's not. And I'd really like to know, but from the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, what kind of class struggle measures they would advise the people in Gaza to resist the fact that they are held under a blockade for years now. They, to a big extent, cannot leave Gaza anyways, and how to show solidarity with their people, which they also think they belong to, who are fighting in Jerusalem, in the West Bank. And by the way, when we look at the statement, our statement was from a couple of days ago, when there hadn't been many rockets as of then. The AWL statement, I think, is a bit more recent. It completely fails to mention, for example, the fact that in the West Bank alone, the Israeli military has killed more than 3 times the number of Palestinians that have been resisting on the street than the rockets have killed by now in the Israeli occupied areas. So I think this is simply something, you know, that simply talking about this appears to you as a support for the politics of Hamas is just outrageous. You know, I mean, before the Hamas became a power, all kinds of other organizations fired such rockets from Gaza. They still do, by the way, just that the Hamas takes over the credit for all of this. I think that the rockets will not change much. But they're really an act of desperation. And we should, by the way, besides this, not blow this out of proportion like the media in Europe does. Yeah. But very briefly, if it came to be that pressure, and only pressure by means of intifada, will force Israel to concede a 2-state solution, should come about and the Palestinians would want to take it, we will certainly not be the ones who tell the Palestinians, you have no right to take it. You have no right to take a Palestinian state on your own. The reality is Israel is not going to grant that, and it has shown this over the years, and it has increased its stance on this. But what we as socialists also have to say is that we think the most progressive solution would be a democratic one-state solution, democratic in the sense of the solution of a bi-national state, yeah, and a socialist revolution. And a socialist state, for that matter. If you think that is a thing that socialists should not promote today, then I think simply you're not revolutionaries. Sorry. And I think you're also not in touch with what the comrade before me has said, of what many Palestinians think. And in fact, the radical left and the left wing of the Israeli Jews. Yeah. If you talk to them, the majority of the radicals will favor this solution. And indeed, BDS, I mean, they're not agitating for a socialist state, but BDS has certainly popularized it by some problems, I think, which are mainly explained by the shortcomings of the campaign, has popularized it, and indeed has popularized it amongst many progressive Jews, not just in Israel, but indeed around the world. If you can't see this, it just means, and I think your statement proves this, you're out of touch with the progressive movements in Palestine, in Israel, and indeed in other countries. I'm not in the UK right now, so I can't say if you participated in the protest, but it wouldn't wonder me if you haven't, or if you don't have that contact.
Okay, thank you, comrade.
Hello. Yeah, so the root of the issue, I think, look, I think I don't know a million Israelis and Palestinians, but I've met a few, and I think it's quite clear that whatever the polls might say at any one point, whether or not a majority or a minority support 2 states, it's quite clear that there is there is national antagonism between these two. Now, it's obviously not an equal national antagonism, because obviously the one national group has a state where they can express their self-determination, and that state actually denies that exact right from another group. But I'm quite certain that a large group of, if I gave a button to a large group of to most Palestinians and said, if you could press this, all the Jews would leave and you can have all of historical Palestine, most Palestinians would probably hit that button. And the same would be the reverse. I think if most Israelis, because of the reactionary nature of Israeli politics these days, were given a button that said all the Arabs could leave to Jordan or whatever, and you can have all this land, probably these days a majority of Israelis would press that button. But the problem is, what rights do they actually have as a nation, as nations? Okay, and the problem I think a lot of people I meet on the left seem to have an issue with is whether or not they view Israel as a nation. The Israeli state was formed by settler colonists, true. That has almost no bearing on the reality of whether or not the Israeli nation exists. And if there is a Hebrew Israeli nation, which there is, and that is class differentiated, that coheres itself as a national entity, do they have a right to self-determination? If they don't, we can have that separate discussion, but then the Palestinians don't either, and we're going to have a completely different discussions. But they do, the Palestinians do, and so do the Israelis. But you can't self-determine in the ether, you self-determine on land. And the best, most consistent democratic way for both of these nations to express their self-determination is for there to be a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Both states will have minorities, and we're not being in favor of physical borders between those states, but there is a Hungarian minority in Slovakia, there is a Slovak minority in Hungary, but both states exist as the expression of their national self-determination of both people. And there is no national antagonism between those two peoples. And that's a prerequisite if we're going to end a national antagonism between these two people. One thing I wanted to bring up was Marcel's balking at the idea that Palestinians would have 22% of historical Palestine. I've always found it slightly strange why people are so wedded to one particular colonial border. The borders of historical Palestine that people have in their heads that are on Fatah and Hamas flags are borders drawn by British imperialism in 1919. Why do you call for one secular democratic state only in this particular polity? Why do you not call for Jordan and the borders of Syria and Lebanon, which are colonial artifacts? Why do we not say we believe in one secular state from the Nile to the Euphrates? Because that's not an answer to anything. That's not an answer to the national antagonism. That's why. So I don't think there's a problem with the rough borders for the two states being the 1967 borders. On the right, return to Palestinian refugees, I'll end it on this. Obviously, everyone expelled by Israel in the 48 war should have a right to go back. But on the issue of the descendants of the Palestinian refugees, I'll just use an analogy. Obviously, every individual should be allowed to move where they like, and that includes Palestinian refugees. But when we look at other modern formations that created through the expulsion of millions of people, the modern state of Poland, the modern what was Czechoslovakia, their modern borders came about after 45 with the expulsion of millions of Germans from their historic homelands. Okay, those Germans had been there for centuries, and they were expelled to make demographic changes into the modern state. Now, we do not say, although we do say that was a crime, there should be restitution for that, just as we say for the Palestinian refugee situation. We do not say the Czech state, the Polish state are nations that do not have the right to self-determination in their modern formations until the return of all the descendants of the German refugees who were expelled from their homelands. We obviously support the right, just as there is the right, because there is a European Union, because there is no national conflict, between Poland and Germany in the modern era. There is the right of Germans to move there, but we do not say that the Czech and the Polish formations are illegitimate formations. They have no, even though it's probably true that if all the descendants of the German refugees went back to what is now the Czech Republic, they would probably at least have a equal parity with the population of the Czech Republic. And finally, I want to stress that if we're going to use the expulsion of Jewish refugees from Arab countries and Muslim countries is not a small matter. It will be needed. It is wrong to say they were not ethnically cleansed from places like Morocco. The fact that they didn't all go is no more an answer than the fact that all the Palestinians were not expelled in 1948 from historical Palestine. There will need to be restitution, and one way to get that restitution is to end national antagonism between firstly the Palestinians and the Israelis, and then the antagonism towards the presence of a Hebrew-Israeli nation in the Middle East, which is still seen as illegitimate by many Arab societies, including countries that have peace treaties with Israel. That needs to be ended. One way, just as the Israelis need to have restitution for the Nakba, the Middle East countries need to come to grips with the Hebrew nation and make restitution for their refugee problem.
Comrades, just want to deal with two questions. The first one is a question raised by Jill in her introduction, which is the question of the Holocaust as being an essential part of the Jewish identity worldwide, and I think nobody would deny that or undermine the importance of that historical memory and so on. However, I think the problem comes when you say that ahistorically, in all circumstances, this is the overriding narrative which gives the Jewish people, in all circumstances, the role of the oppressed. And I think that, that is a real problem. It's a form of identity politics, and it falls into the problem of not being able to look at things in their historical real context and see who the aggressor is and who the oppressed is. So I think that, it's not the only time in history where an oppressed group has turned into an oppressor group. Look at the Protestants and their role in Ireland, for example. I think that, we've got a similar situation here, obviously on a completely different sort of timescale and so on, but it is that. So I think that we must recognize that we have to judge things as they historically appear. And as Mariam said, that is different in different parts of the world. The second thing I wanted to say was about the Jewish Arab worker unity slogan, which of course in the abstract is fine, but I think, the problem is that if that really means that one group has to give up their national struggle in effect, then it is unity on the basis of the oppressor nation's privileges and national oppression of the other side. And I think that, it would mean that, even as described, I think, by Ben or someone who described what they meant by a two-state solution as being a temporary stage, this temporary stage that Palestinians are supposed to endure is one in which 3.8 million refugees are actually oppressed in their host countries, unable to return to their family homes from 70 years ago, or in some instances, unable to till land which, in fact, they live only a few miles away, but actually is in Israel and not in the occupied territories. Therefore, they're not allowed to actually return then and use their land, etc. And I think that then you got the second-class citizen status for 2 million Palestinians living inside, with the right of assembly, the right of political organization, in many cases, the right to vote for parties of their choice, and so on. I think, that is the problem. You're saying that workers' unity can be forged if you drop all of that and even drop the immediate issues, as the AWL leaflet did to the demonstration last Saturday, of Sheikh Jarrah, of the situation in Gaza, on the annexation program to make Israel the sole capital of, ethnically cleansed of Palestinians, which is what Sheikh Jarrah is about. You say, drop all that, and maybe we can have a joint campaign on housing. Maybe we can have a joint campaign on wages. It is economism, and it actually undermines the importance of the national question, despite your professed dealing with it. The only solution which can solve that problem is a solution that actually says that there needs to be a binational state, which we believe can only be brought about through the working class's own actions and be a worker state, which can then give equal rights to all of its citizens. Our aim is to break up the Zionist bloc, a cross-class bloc, and actually, neutralize the fighting will of the majority, or win over at least the most active elements of the Jewish working class. And that does mean mobilizing as far and wide as possible. I agree with Dave Stockton, who said that this is where the international working class has to bear its weight on the situation in order to stop this struggle and bring about justice for all the parties concerned, especially the oppressed party, which is the Palestinians. So I think that internationalism is not saying no, there's no role for the Jewish working class, but it's to say that the hammer blow of international solidarity, the continued resistance to every single manifestation of oppression, indeed a third intifada, will actually do a lot to actually dislodge the Jewish working class from their class oppressors, the Israeli bourgeoisie, and behind them the Western imperialists.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, so we're going to have something up. Sorry to people who have not been able to get into the discussion. There's quite a number of you. You could see that there was a lot going on. We're going to go over. So, comrades, could you just take about 6 or 7 minutes to sum up? I know that's not a lot of time, but we are running very late. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. So, Marcel.
Yeah. Okay, thank you to everybody who contributed in the discussion. Obviously, I can't come back to every single point, but I'll come back to some of the most important ones, in my opinion. I think to me, and then I'll make some general remarks. To me, I think the question of return is central to this debate. I think it's, as I said in my original introduction, it's one of the main reasons why the two-state solutions that are being proposed simply do not give the Palestinians the justice that they deserve. And I think when we compare the situation of Palestinians in refugee camps to Moroccan Jews in France or to Sudeten Germans, I think it sort of misunderstands the principal dynamic here, which is that Palestinians in other Arab countries are simply not allowed to return to their home. Israel doesn't let them enter. Sudeten Germans, Moroccan Jews, they can return to their homeland whenever they like. They might not be welcomed back, but it's a fundamentally different situation to what the Palestinians face abroad. And then another point that I think is crucial is the question of international solidarity. At one point, Comrade said that the working class internationally do not have the ability to change the course of events in Palestine. And I think, well, if that's true, then what is the point of international solidarity? We can see at the moment that dock workers in Italy are supporting the Palestinians by refusing to ship goods to Israel. And I think this is precisely what the working class in outside of the region should be doing. And one more point on return. It was said that it's simply not possible to accommodate the many millions of Palestinian refugees back to Israel. But I think it's not for Israel or anybody to make that declaration. I think it's a fundamental right that you can return to lands from which you were ethnically cleansed. It's not, as was said, a right to reclaim your precise homes. It's a right to return to the state from which you were kicked out of. And I think this is fundamental and this is non-negotiable. And I can't see how socialists can say that Israel does have a right to prevent the Palestinian return, especially at a time when Palestinian youth and Palestinians in general have shown that they can mobilize in hundreds of thousands around the question of return. But anyway, to make some more general concluding remarks, I've argued that the two-state solution, which was always a reactionary utopia since it barred the question of return while opening the doors to continued settlement, this is dead, the two-state solution. We argue for a single state from the river to the sea, in which all citizens have equal rights to use their language, to express and develop their cultures. In other words, we argue for a binational state. We totally reject any idea of driving out the Jewish Israeli nation. We have never said such a thing, just as we reject the ethnically Jewish definition of the present state. We argue that only firm foundation for this solution is for unity between the Israeli and Palestinian working class on the basis of the abandonment of the privileges, political privilege and economic privileges that the Israeli working class have. And this can only really happen when the continued existence of the Zionist state becomes impossible for them. How can this be achieved? As we've said in the discussion, the tiny military forces of the Palestinians against the IDF and its support from the United States, it cannot win this militarily. And as long as the ruling classes of those countries smear the people in their own countries as anti-Semites for supporting the Palestinians, this will not happen. I think this is a big difference that we have with the comrades in the AWL, because they gave credence to this, to some of the accusations that happened in the Labour Party, that the left are anti-Semites, and this is particularly poisonous in the left of the Labour movement, because this is potentially the most powerful ally that the Palestinians have in ending their national oppression. And for this reason, another act of international solidarity we support is the BDS campaign. Even though we're critical of its limitations, yeah, even this has brought about a massive campaign orchestrated by Israel and their supporters, and shows how much Israel fears any weakening of its support from Western imperialist countries. It needs to be expanded into a system of workers' boycotts and everything that sustains the Israeli state's oppression of the Palestinians. As we've argued, to return to the question of the debate, two states or one, this is the result of a very different political analysis, a very different understanding of what the Israeli state is, what Zionism is. And a comrade asked, on what terms is the two-state solution unviable? It's unviable based on the fact that Israel has single-handedly destroyed it by violating the supposed rights that the Palestinian authorities have through the relentless construction of settlements and the movement of their own population into the territory. It's utopian, and as I've argued earlier, it doesn't achieve the justice that the Palestinians are fighting for. So for that reason, that's why we are arguing for the single secular, and I stress, because it was raised in the discussion, socialist Palestinian state. So yeah, thank you everyone for the discussion. I look forward to the next one.
Thank you very much, comrades. Okay, Jill.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's been a good discussion. I think with the exception of one person saying he was appalled by the lack of Palestinians, and it not been a good discussion at all. I think it has been. I think it's been well balanced and thoughtful. I want to come back on various things that people have said, if I might. So I'm going to start with Marcel's introduction. And I think there were several things that were lacking, and the most obvious one to me was he gave no analysis to the idea of nationhood. Instead, he focused on and he listed a lot of the brutalities of the Israeli state, and they for sure exist. And then he chose to reduce Israeli Jews to the state. And I think this is a real problem. In Marcel's single binational state, all citizens will have equal rights. Well, a whole group of those citizens will identify as a national group, the Israeli Jews, as will the Palestinian Arabs, and having individual rights, equal individual rights, yeah, will not satisfy their immediate national identity. There are two nations, and there needs to be two states. Minerva, she said she didn't recognise the right of Israel to exist. Well, that's fine. You don't have to recognise it. No one can make you. The fact is, it does exist, and it's a reality. Marcel said that self-defence was abstract. In what way is it abstract? Imagine France routinely being threatened by Italy, Germany, and Spain, insisting it has no right to exist. That's not abstract. That's precisely the concrete situation of Israel. Barbara from the International Bolshevik Tendency said that the AWL are wrong to be looking for solutions under capitalism. Well, what's going on in Israel-Palestine right now needs some relief, and we can't tell them to wait for the revolution. In order for the working class to unite in the first place, the working class have to exist. And if the Israeli working class is to become the casualties of the anti-imperialist united front out to smash Israel, then socialist revolution is off the agenda anyway, I think. We should advocate for a socialist revolution first, but we should agitate for the working class to exist, the right for Israel to exist and not to be smashed or driven into the sea. And I know Marcel has just said that is not what they are arguing or they would say, but the reality is somewhat different, I think. Tim Nelson said we have to give unconditional solidarity to the Palestinians and then interchanges the Palestinians with Hamas. A single state ruled by Hamas is not in any way progressive, not least of all for the Palestinian working class, for Palestinian women, for trade unions, or for socialists. International socialists have a responsibility, an absolute responsibility, to be outspoken and critical of Hamas, and not to confuse Hamas with Palestinians per se. For Red Flag, the right to return is not a right to return for the third and fourth generation of Palestinians. The reality is of what they're arguing, on the scale that they describe it, it is the right to expel Jews from Israel. Ben's point that two states is not a solution, rather a realisable progress to relieve the situation of Palestinians and to give both peoples the opportunity to build democratic class links, shouldn't need to be made. Of course, revolutionary socialists don't see two states as an end in itself. Comrades, I'll end with this. The single binational state that Red Flag proposes is to add to the catastrophe of the Palestinian people by making it a condition of their liberation, the bloody conquest of another people, not simply of a state, but of a people. This is not the business of revolutionary socialists.